Hi, this is Melanie from Marcus Evans. Thank you all for attending today's webinar, Enhancing Trial Operations, Reimagining Investigator Meetings and Site Initiation Visits for Visual Success, brought to you in partnership with ScienceMedia. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. As you can see at the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. All the widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can submit them to the Q&A widget. We will try to answer as many as possible, but if a fuller answer is needed, or we run out of time, we will make sure to follow up with you in a separate email after the webinar. A copy of today's slide deck and additional help materials are available in the resource list. We encourage you to download any resources or bookmark any links you may find useful. For the best viewing experience, we recommend using a wired internet connection and closing any programs or browser sessions running in the background. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen. A reminder to look out for an email within 2 hours after the webinar is done with links to download the webinar slides and recording. At this point, I would like to briefly introduce you to our presenter. Joining us today, we've got Mark Surles, CEO of ScienceMedia.
Thank you, Melanie. My name is Mark Surles, and I'm the CEO of ScienceMedia. I want to thank all of our attendees on the webinar today and want to introduce our two great speakers. You'll be hearing from them in our Q&A and throughout this presentation. First, we have Laura Vessey. She is Director of Early Development, Clinical Oncology at Johnson & Johnson Pharmaceutical Company. Also, we have Surabhi Sharma, Director of Clinical Sciences and Clinical Operations at Sanofi. Disclaimer that both Laura and Surabhi have no financial interest in ScienceMedia, and their views are their own and not those of their employer. By the end of the webinar, we hope that you will have learned how to make investigator meetings and site initiation visits more engaging, more effective, memorable, and shorten the amount of time you need to prepare for them. We're going to have some slides and Q&A with our panelists internally to address common pitfalls and tools that ScienceMedia and our sponsors have used to improve and get better outcomes with these meetings. We're going to spend a few minutes on tips, tricks on how you may implement change in your organization, and then turn over to the last 20 minutes to have audience Q&A. Please fill out any questions you have online, and we'll be getting to those in the last part of this presentation. First, I want to introduce ScienceMedia. We say ScienceMedia teaches complex medical topics simply. For 25 years, we focused exclusively on the life science industry, and in particular, clinical and medical affairs. We deliver all our training online, and we do that through engaging adult learning principles. ScienceMedia focuses primarily on clinical. We develop all our training in-house through a team of MD and PhD level writers, instructional designers, and graphic artists. And we have one product called SMI Source, which is the leading disease state resource for clinical ops and medical affairs in many of the large clinical research organizations, pharmaceutical companies, and biotech companies. Before we start specifically with investigator meetings, let's take a step back and say what's common among quality, well-run clinical trials. We have better data, cleaner data, fewer subjects, shorter timelines. You know, we at ScienceMedia sit back and say, so why do we accept that important avoidable protocol deviations happen and thus result, as you see on the left side, with the opposite? Reduced power, need to recruit more subjects, that costs more time, more money. At the bottom, the graph shows that with anything, a clinical trial or any class, you expect some errors in the beginning, but you'd expect that to fall off very quickly over time. That's not the reality with clinical trials. From various papers, we know that the error rates or the protocol deviations keep happening, and that can be because of the complexity of the procedures, can be staff changes over time, language, culture, maybe it's time to first patient in. So why do all the training in an investigator meeting or a site initiation visit when you may not have a patient for 6 months or 12 months, and you will have forgotten that. We believe the protocol education that takes place at investigator meetings and at SIVs is ineffective. We've all heard that it's sort of death by PowerPoint. We like to joke that how do you teach on a 100-page protocol? Well, you copy it over to 100 PowerPoint slides and go slide by slide through it. It's the same training for everybody and for all pages. You don't really focus or emphasize the high-risk areas where you could have protocol deviations. And except for literally sign here, I've attended the meeting, or I understand, there's really no true understanding of who knows what and what they don't know. And that's actually a requirement now of E6 R2. Additionally, you can put the very best KOL or medical director up there and give a presentation, but we still know you're going to forget the information over time. It just happens. Now you take that slide deck and you arm 4 or 5 clinical research associates who don't have that level of expertise, and they're not going to do as good of a job, but nicely you're still going to forget things over time. So one take home is that learning should be distributed over time. That's not just our view. Here are a few quotes to set the stage. First, from the former FDA commissioner that says, "It's critical for us to figure out how to do clinical trials efficiently. Docs are frustrated with the growing bureaucracy," and think of, check here, sign there. Additionally, surveys have shown that investigators lack time for just redundant training, often the GCP level training, and a majority of sites identify that there are quality issues with the content we are providing them at the IMs and the SIVs. Finally, a quote from ACRP that we'll come back to during this presentation is around a quiz. A pre-quiz unearths valuable insights about what one knows and what they don't know. You can then be armed with that knowledge when you go into an investigator meeting so that you can customize education to ensure that the audience leaves the meeting trained to be as effective as possible. Let's turn to our panelists and get their opinion, starting with experience with bad investigator meetings. Surabhi, what challenges have you experienced in traditional investigator meetings? And now that everything's moving online and virtual meetings, do you expect this to cause even more problems?
Thanks a lot, Mark, for that very important question. I can tell you that the 2 most important things that always cause an issue with investigator meetings are AE, not to confuse with adverse events, but attendance and engagement. First of all, it's very difficult to convince the investigators, especially the busy investigators, to come to the meeting for a full day, maybe sometimes even 2 days. So to leave a busy practice and all the other things that they are responsible for. And similarly with the site staff also. They all try to wiggle their room out of it. And then the other thing is, even if you bring them in and you have everyone sitting in a big conference hall and we are ready to do the investigator meeting, engagement seems to be the other problem. They could be somewhere else mentally during the slideshows. Death by PowerPoint, as I say. So to keep them engaged becomes the next big problem. Now with more and more of digital media, it becomes even bigger problem how to keep them engaged, especially when everyone has, a device in their hand.
Understood. First, it's a new definition for me for an AE, but engagement is the primary issue we're trying to solve. And I believe with the virtual meetings, there's some tricks we're going to talk about today to address that. Laura, now let's switch over to site initiation visits. With the SIVs, at least versus the investigator meetings, we've removed travel time as an objection from investigators and attendees. But then we introduced new issues like you have the CRAs presenting and there's inconsistency among CRAs as you do large trials around the world. My question to you, Laura, is what issues do you find that are exacerbated at SIV meetings, and especially if they're big, large ones? And do you see additional problems or even benefits by now moving to virtual online meetings?
Yes, thank you for that, Mark. I feel like Surabhi's answer with regard to the new definition of AE, attention and engagement, is a perennial problem for SIV visits as well. So I think we will talk about some of those solutions. But you bring up a good point in that the travel issue is reduced and money is saved by moving to virtual SIVs. However, there are some issues with that. And I think you bring up another good point about the size of the meeting. I happen to focus in early development, and I would say where possible, we, like our clinical team, the physician and the scientist, to be a part of our SIVs so that that block of the background of the compound and some of the clinical information is consistent. Because you also do point out on the slide that there can be inconsistencies if the same presenter is not making the same points. So there are ways around that. We can talk about those pre-recorded sessions, etc. But we do feel like where it's possible to have the clinical team present to answer some of those questions is important. You know, the other challenge that you get into, as you say, are multiple sites, multiple time zones, etc. So there are problems and challenges, but there are some silver linings as well. So the SIV attendees are able to view those modules if they're sent prior to the meeting, or view the modules when at their convenience, when they feel like it's appropriate. So that's nice. And I think, you know, the engagement piece, we're going to talk about that, but ways to stay engaged, I think, you know, some of those that we can talk about are polling, questionnaires, knowledge checks, etc. So those are some, I think, of what we'll get into in the next slide, but there are benefits to virtual meetings for sure. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and it's a great segue for us to move into what applications we've tried at ScienceMedia and that you've tried to actually improve these meetings when they're face-to-face and now should apply even better now that we've gone virtual. ScienceMedia uses best practices and principles of adult learning to improve retention with actually less time in presentations. And that's, again, sort of the traditional PowerPoint approach. So how do we apply that to improve investigator meetings and SIVs? This slide shows that whether it's an investigator meeting or just a college course or this webinar, you come in knowing less than hopefully you know when you leave, but then tomorrow comes around and you're already starting to forget much of it. Yet we want to arm our investigators and our study coordinators with material that they remember when they're operationalizing the clinical trial. So with adult learning, we divide it up into several sections. First, there's pre-read or the foundational training done before you go into an investigator meeting. Then during the investigator meeting, it's shorter and more focused, but it allows you to have real-world clinical scenarios and applications of what you learned in the pre-read. And then third, the material you're not going to need until you're dealing with patients, and it might be 6 months from now. Well, we make that available just in time during the study. Additionally, adult learning says that the form of delivery basically shouldn't be PowerPoint or just a video recording of somebody talking to PowerPoint. Instead, it should be short multimedia segments. So think YouTube, where it's video, it's animated, it's got voiceovers. Additionally, we make it interactive, so click here for more information or answering questions, etc. And it's short. So each segment is 3 minutes, 5 minutes, what we call micro-learning. It's self-paced, so you can do it on your own time. You can back up, you can fast forward, so you tune it to what you know and also allow you to absorb it much better than in a live meeting. We basically are providing the best training we can, and then that training is sent out to all sites so it's consistent. You don't have the inconsistency that happens with multiple CRAs giving it. Other tools that we use are knowledge checks. So after we teach one thing, then we ask a couple questions and provide active feedback right then. And additionally, we have a bank of questions or assessments at the end to measure that you actually do understand the material or identify where we need to spend some additional time. In the life science industry, this is standard practice in your commercial teams, your Salesforce teams, and quite often in the larger companies with how medical liaisons are trained. And we're just now, or over the last few years, pulling this methodology into clinical trials. Outside of pharma and biotech, the Fortune 500s have pretty much standardized on this approach. IBM reports that with their user base, they learned 5 times more materials in the same amount of time. Others report how much better this helps with implementing change or change management, and how's that apply to clinical trials? Well, quite often what you're asking someone to do on a particular assessment or procedure is different than standard of care. And in a busy environment, the COVID world, with people trying to do too much with too little time, they'll naturally go to what they normally do, which might not be the actual steps, the dosing, the preparation, et cetera, that's needed for this clinical trial. ScienceMedia applies those principles in an application called SMI Trial, which we say is a new approach to risk mitigation. It's also a new approach to how you can have shorter, more engaging and focused investigator meetings and site initiation visits. Fundamentally, we've now spread that education over time with pre-meeting materials that you need to cover and then a shorter investigator meeting. Likewise, we spread some of the material out to ongoing access. In particular, if we drill into that, the training is covered or focuses on the highest risk areas for protocol deviations. That is, we're not going to go page by page by page through the protocol. Read the protocol. Now, take this training, which will be focused on where you may have mistakes. That information comes from risk assessments that you do on the protocol. It may come from lessons learned from prior related studies. And then ScienceMedia takes that material and develops what you see on the left side here. Some protocol essentials, material on the investigational product, disease and standard of care, clinical scenarios, and importantly, a comprehension measure so that we record for E6R2 that everyone knows what they're supposed to do in running this clinical trial. And for the IM, and for the SIV, you know ahead of time where people are still having troubles, and you can address that there. Over on the right side is what we call our operational excellence, so materials that are available just when you need it for a subject visit. In addition to pushing out, say, protocol amendments, it's not just what changed, but why. If people understand the why, they have a much better ability to remember it. Over longer studies, we may observe best practices and put that material out. And here's how it ties into your investigator meetings. Most of our sponsors require this material to be taken, this training to be taken before you enter an investigator meeting or a site initiation visit. It's role-based, so the total time of training here may be about 2 hours, and you make have your study teams watch all of that. But for any one person, it's typically about 1 hour. So the pharmacist may need additional information that they can watch, but the PI, for instance, is not going to spend any time on the disease or standard of care. Additionally, the system measures the completion and measures the comprehension piece, and it's multimedia throughout. So now when you walk into your face-to-face or virtual investigator meeting, you no longer need to cover all of that material. Instead, do a repeat on the most critical items. So you're really driving that home. It's the second or third time the attendees are hearing this. What it does is it provides space. You now have much more time in your meeting, even if it's a shorter meeting, to have engaging clinical scenarios. And most of the investigators I talk to, though they dislike travel and coming to investigator meetings, they actually crave having that peer-to-peer conversation about real-world patients and scenarios. Finally, this approach is not a one-time event. The material is still available as you get new staff members on. Also, as monitoring starts to pick up signals or problems, you can push back material, maybe a 5-minute piece, reminding someone of how a particular assessment needs to happen and reapply it. Briefly, let me apply that with a couple of scenarios. One is a study where a sponsor needed to have the site staff educate the patients on self-injection at home. In a prior study, they had taken this material that's spread over multiple pages and footnotes and tables and produced a one-page job aid for the study staff. But they found that it still didn't work right. So in our example, we were brought in to make a multimedia piece where here's one screen where it starts by, explaining the syringe and packaging and that sort. Then how do you warm it, and you take it out and you wait a certain amount of time rather than sticking it in a microwave or vigorously shaking, sort of lessons learned from prior studies. And then how to prepare your injection site and where to inject and what to do if you have redness or soreness in different areas. A separate example is one that nurses use, where quite often in studies that have parallel arms with differences on site visits, like maybe the dosing's different or the assessments are different. How do you remember that, especially if it's 6 months or 12 months after your site initiation visit? So they can pull up on their phone or mobile device interactive tool where they can go in and click on a particular visit and then see a list and details of what they need to do. So nurses are doing this prior to subjects coming in. And finally, on the back end, we record certificates of completion for your E6R2 compliance. We have tools that before you have your IM or your SIV, you can look and see who hasn't finished training and send out reminders to them. And from the assessment, the questionnaire part, you can drill in and try to understand why people are missing certain questions. And perhaps that's a language or cultural issue. Maybe it's going to be a broader issue to the whole protocol, and this analysis allows you to hit the problem head on rather than wait for the protocol deviations and have corrective action later. Now that you've seen how ScienceMedia approaches these issues, I want to turn to our panelists and see what innovations have you deployed in face-to-face meetings, and what innovations are you either planning or have already tried with virtual meetings to make these more effective? Laura, let's start with you.
Thank you. So straight out of the gates, I think it needs to be a more humanized meeting and make it relatable. So it's important to have a sort of grabber in the beginning. So I think something like an icebreaker or a preset, bio of their interests, of the various people in the meeting. I mean, you can look that up on the web, but some sort of humanization of the meeting to grab them. These are unprecedented times, and people want tips, they want to be relatable, and anything you can do to engage them up front, I think. A pre-read.
I add something here? You know, in line with what you said, we did that with our virtual meetings, actually. The virtual SIVs, we allowed a few minutes up front for people to share their photos or where they are sitting, their desk, or, you know, small little details. And that seemed to be working really well, especially in this virtual world where everyone is sheltering in place and craving for human interaction. I think that went really well.
Thank you, Surabhi, and I'm happy to hear that. We had talked about, as well, you and I, about a pre-read package, and I think you have some things that you'd like to share on that front too, but we have tried that, you know, to send, to have the site pre-read and drive those questions and highlight what the site wants to talk about at the SIV meeting. They may have particular challenges, right? Maybe it's drug preparation. Maybe they're not familiar with your data management package. So that sort of pre-read and pre-conversation, it's worth the investment in the work that you do with the site up front to make it a more meaningful meeting. Surabhi, do you want to talk about what you've done on that front?
Right. I completely echo what you're saying. In addition, especially for some of the investigator meetings that we did recently, we recorded the whole investigator meeting with our medical director, with our more senior CRAs, and we sent out the video to our sites well ahead in advance before the investigator meeting date, so that they could use it as a pre-read. They could, you know, watch it at their own pace, at their own time. They don't have to sit in the investigator meeting for straight 2 or 3 hours. They come prepared, and then they can straight away, you know, get into the Q&A with our medical directors who are going to be online. It had mixed feelings. We saw some of the sites came prepared. They really liked the idea of having such a pre-read to be able to pace it out at their own speed. But other sites that were already having too much on their plate did not have time to devote to that. So there are some positives and negatives to that. But definitely a big positive was that there was consistency in the message, unlike what we have been hearing in our SIVs, where the you know, it depends on the CRA, it depends on the medical advisor who's in the local area, in the country, who goes out to do a SIV, and it all depends on how experienced they are and how they are delivering. At least for the SIVs, it was definitely a more consistent approach. Everyone, wherever in the world they were, they heard the same message. So whether they did take it into account as a pre-read or not, but at least even if they did not come prepared, at the SIVs, there was a consistent message across the world at all sites.
Right.
Thank you, Surabhi. Sorry, Laura, I was just going to say that mirrors what we just heard on the pre-read. Part of what we've used and other sponsors have used is, you know, if you do this ahead of time, then we guarantee the meeting will be far, far shorter. And that's a nice carrot. Laura, did you have something further to add?
I was just going to say that in doing a bit of research in prep for this, the data comes back that the attendance on SIV meetings is much better if they're done virtually. So that's a pro, definitely.
Completely agree, yeah.
Yes, that's what we have found. and really the ability to say it's going to be shorter, and I like your approach where then they drive the questions, mirrors very much the approach of don't sort of do a death by PowerPoint, but let them effectively drive the meeting, even though you still have your key points that you'll drill in on.
Right. Absolutely.
Well, thank you. We have one last topic to briefly cover before we open the line to audience questions and answers. We thought we should address how do you institute change. We've been doing this for many years now, and ScienceMedia at least encounters things like, this is all great, but then I get back to my day job and the investigator meeting's coming up next week. What do you mean we have to actually prepare in advance? And the other common question is, sites are already busy. Aren't they going to complain about this approach? In a second, we'll get our panelists to give a few tips and tricks, but ScienceMedia looks at it from give facts, give examples. So first off, for you, the sponsors, this approach at least gives you compliance with E6R2, where you're recording that people understand what they're supposed to do. And frankly, in our view and a number of the CRO's views, this is going to be a subject of future regulatory audits. From a site issue, here's one quote, but across the board, we keep hearing this is refreshing, it's interesting, it's not death by PowerPoint. It allows people to drill in deeper based on their role, or lighter if they already know some of the material. And then finally, time and money always tend to resonate. We have examples where in a phase 3 study, a large sponsor and large CRO looked at the deviation rates and found we were very clean. That is, we're in the top 90th percentile of all comparable studies. We have even seen on the other end where a study completed 6 or 7 months ahead of schedule, and when we drilled into that, trying to figure out why, it was that they had a very clean data set. They weren't getting the patient dropouts that they had in a prior study. They weren't messing up on some of the patients and the dosing, and thus they didn't have to keep open and further enroll additional patients. In the end, they got regulatory approval in Europe and in the US 7 months ahead of schedule. So panelists, Laura, Surabhi, do you have any tips that we can give to our attendees on how to institute this change? Let's start with Laura, and then Surabhi, hear what you have to say.
Sure. So change management is very challenging, and the most important part of it is, of course, making it stick. And I think the first suggestion that I would have is you need support from the top down and the bottom up. So you've got to secure that before you go forward with the new concept. I also feel like providing a rationale for why this is going to be better and believing in that is really important, because at the end of the day, people don't want their job to be harder. You need to present the rationale for why this is going to be better. What are the positives here? And then, really at the end of the day, look at the data, look at the metrics, and that will support your rationale for change. So those are my tips. Surabhi, do you have some tips for us?
Yeah, 100% agree with whatever you said. I think as more and more data is being collected, and we are in the process of analyzing how this new world order is changing all of us, what people's preferences are and how they are changing, I think it will become important to make use of the data that we are gathering, get people's preferences, and you talk about justifying that. I think it will come from the data, from the feedback that we are getting from our attendees to our investigator meetings and SIVs. So hopefully it will not be that difficult to create a justification when the attendees themselves want a certain thing. And eventually, I think if more and more people are getting comfortable with the electronic media and the preferences change, the rest of the stragglers would also come along pretty soon. I guess at the end of it, it's all about muscle memory. The more you practice, the more you get better at something. So I remember when we started in this lockdown, a few of our friends did not even know how to attend a Zoom meeting, and now they are pros. So I think the more you try, the better you become, and that is how it's going to evolve.
Thank you very much, and a good conclusion there. We've talked about how to change the meeting and make it more interactive for the attendees, but you bring up another good point that we didn't touch on today, which is even when you present, when you're conducting a meeting, it's different than standing up in front of a live audience. And we've done some tricks and have some approaches to help with that we just haven't been able to get to today, but perhaps it will come up in some of the audience question and answer. Thank you, Laura and Surabhi, for a great dialogue. Let's now go to our audience and see what questions they have. Please remember to submit questions in the online chat window. And as a reminder, we will summarize these questions after the meeting in case we don't get to anyone or to everyone. Well, we're already getting some questions in, and we've had some questions submitted when some of the attendees registered. So let's start with one that we didn't cover in the presentation, which is around the recent FDA guidance. Laura, there's a question that says, how does the recent FDA guidance pertain to site initiations and activations?
Thanks, Mark. There have been no shortages of FDA guidances since March 18th. I think we're up to around 55, which is very helpful. And then layered on top of that are company guidances. So there's really no one playbook to go by. I think the one thing that's clear from a company perspective and an industry perspective, I should say, is that the COVID-19 needs to be in the title of anything that's filed. So I just wanted to put that out there right now. But there are many guidances around home health care, deviations, amendments, direct to patients, all putting the patient safety at the center of everything. So there are guidances around the activities that go into a site initiation visit, but not necessarily per se on the meetings. There's even a guidance document on meetings, but it's not specific to site initiation or investigator meetings. I hope that's somewhat helpful, but the guidance documents that do exist do provide a framework for us.
Great. We have several questions around engagement, and maybe we just sort of, direct one to each of you. And so Surabhi, there's a question on how do you avoid lack of engagement from site staff that are typical of running online investigator meetings.
Yeah, so that's always a challenge. I know this has been a challenge even before COVID-19 when we all went virtual, but now it's becoming even bigger challenge. How do you keep everyone engaged, especially in investigator meeting? So you already heard about a few things, meaning you can send out some recordings or pre-reads, let them come prepared. That helps. They come prepared to ask the right questions. They come prepared to ask the things that really matter. And then the other things that we have been doing during the meetings are randomly at some checkpoints asking questions pertaining to the protocol or pertaining to the presentations. And there are some points that are awarded for right answers, and the winners can actually make use of those points for things like maybe some kind of a tchotchke or some kind of a in a virtual world, it's becoming even more difficult to give any sort of prize or anything, but as long as there is appreciation associated with it and some kind of a prize, you would be surprised how many people actually get motivated due to that.
Okay, good observation. Laura, then sort of related to engagement is a question that says, how do you get the sites to actually interact during the virtual meetings?
Right. So we talked a little bit about that, but I think these are probably common sense principles. But I always find that you mentioned knowledge check marks. I think those are helpful. Polling questions during the meeting are always useful as well to make sure they're engaged. Videos, animation, anything but the words on the slide that are really dull and boring, because you're going to lose those people. Yeah, I think any of those tricks help and will sort of demand focus. And I saw there's a question here too about humanizing the meeting, and I think I mentioned that earlier. I think to get that engagement up front, it doesn't have to be where people work or, a special question, but just some engagement that pitches it at the human level so that you get some uptake right away.
Makes sense. And I want to address a third sort of engagement question that came along because we didn't really address this, but you mentioned it with polling. The question was, in the near future, what are the recommendations of the format and methods? And we addressed some of that in the presentation, but what we didn't really have is a lot of the WebExes and GoToMeetings and that sort have features where you can poll the audience. And rather than going around, especially in a larger investigator meeting, going around and asking each person to answer, they electronically can answer questions and that sort. And then what we tend to do is arm the presenter, whether that's a CRA or whomever, with, these are expected wrong answers that are going to come up and how you can sort of address those. And then for the correct answer, then you can sort of reach out to Dr. So-and-so who's on the line and say, why do you think that is the right answer? So the technology that's available really starts to collate and help with polling questions nowadays that, it's different than actually live meetings. So there's some upsides with this type of engagement. Let's see, just to clarify, right at the beginning, we said that, the disclaimers for both of our speakers, but a question that came in on how does J&J and Sanofi work with ScienceMedia, and I guess I should answer that one. We purposely picked two large sponsors that we're not working with directly because we believe that it's a big industry-wide problem, and the sponsors, the various vendors like us and others are all trying to tackle this. So we didn't want to bias this with a bunch of customers on the call. So hopefully someday they will be customers, but right now there aren't. So remember, you can send in your questions through the box on the screen, and we'll go ahead and check out a few others. I guess related, there's a question that says, and we have to experience a lot, what are your suggestions for CRAs that are conducting an SIV? A lot of times we get feedback that CRA is not able to explain the product or the scientific background as well. What can you do to improve that? And I think part of our multimedia approach, or what we said is, you can get a KOL that's a great speaker. Well, let's sort of capture that, whether it's video or instructional approach, and then the CRA gets to benefit from that. And likewise, we then build up, decks, PowerPoints, that sort for them with sort of how to best deliver it and that sort. But I'd like both of our panelists to weigh in and say, how do you experience, or what have you done to support the CRAs that may not be as knowledgeable as the medical directors?
Well, I would just offer that wherever we can, we ask the clinical team, especially the physician, to call in to talk about the actual compound and the background. I think on the receiving end, it's most welcome, and that eliminates the need for the CRA to be that expert. And maybe it's a member of the clinical team, but I do think that helps. And also, not having the CRA have to conduct a whole meeting and bringing in the subject matter experts who do know that part of the SIV meeting. And that brings me to another question that I think I saw in here too about modules of the SIV. And in participating in and talking with site managers, I think that the best way to go about an SIV is to have modules, because you might arrive at the site at 9 o'clock thinking that you're going to take off and talk about the background and the clinical portion of this, and you've got your clinical team calling in, but actually then the PI can't get there until noon. And so now you need to talk about data management, or you need to talk about a different module. So I think everybody knows this, but you do have to be flexible with your SIV meeting. And I think preparing it in blocks and having speakers that maybe even black out a half a day, because they're not entirely sure when they're going to have to engage with the PI and the study coordinators is helpful. Surabhi?
Yeah, I believe that would be a good thing to have modules separated out. And then there was another question which said about the great speakers. A great meeting is related, there is a correlation between a great meeting and a great presenter. So if you can have these modules pre-recorded by the medical team, by the clinical team, I think they can choose some of the good presenters in the company. You can have meaningful information presented. I think it all eventually relates, and I think that is going to improve the engagement also.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add one more thing on, and Sanal, to your great question. In the money that you're saving by doing the virtual meetings, I've seen it sometimes repurposed into a professional facilitator. Not every SIV or investigator meeting is going to need that, but it's maybe something to consider. They're out there. They know clinical research, and it might be something to think about.
Yes, as I mentioned, some of what we do, not just for investigator meetings, but even KOL events and others, is not quite the professional support, but still sort of coaching tools and putting in the narrative within the slides and that sort, even the polling questions, providing not just the question, but helping that speaker, presenter, understand how to field the answers and explain why this is the wrong answer and the right answer. And that seems to be helping out at the CRA level as well. We've got another question that I'm curious to hear how you answer. It says, do you recommend requiring video, so live video, which we're not doing right now, to be in your virtual meetings, and further to ensure that they're engaged and paying attention? I'm interested in hearing what you two have done there, because in the last 3 months, my company has certainly done enough Zoom meetings, and at first we weren't doing video, and then when we turned it on, it seemed like people were interrupting less because you could actually see somebody who's about to talk or ask a question. And now we've pretty much instituted having live video in our internal meetings. But what's your policy both internal at your companies and with regards to the site?
So we
Surabhi,
don't have
would you like to try that one?
Policy. Yeah, absolutely. So we don't have a set policy that we require videos, but as you said, it's always good to have. And what the feedback what we have received so far actually supports that. If you have a live person and you can actually see the live video, the person is sitting and is attentive. The recipient also shows or reciprocates the same feeling. So we are not requiring it right now, but we have seen that it does improve engagement, even though you might be playing some of the pre-recorded videos or animations, as long as the attendees can see a live person. It always helps. Laura, you want to add something?
Laura, you might be on mute. That's
I am.
Real fun.
Sorry, I agree with Surabhi. There's no set policy, but when the video is on, people feel more engaged. And in many ways, they've had fun with the virtual Zoom backgrounds, changing those up and commenting on those. We've gotten to enter into people's homes and lives in a sort of more human way than we ever have before. And, people share the same issues with the dogs barking and the kids, et cetera. But I think overall, the virtual videos and Zooms are a positive thing.
Here's an interesting question that's come in. It says, what is the best practice to capture attendance, especially when people are in the same room and you're not live? Well, our view has been it's the training that you need to capture or have it as an audit trail that people have been trained. And by having the pre-read, and if it's in a system or a learning management system or whatever, then you do have that record that somebody has watched it. But this question is, then you still have your SIV and people are around the table, so it's not an electronic sort of login per person. How do you capture who attended, and how do you have a regulatory trail for that? Laura, what have you done?
That's a good question. I do think that there are ways, and I'm not an IT expert, but I would be interested in looking into it further because I think it's a good question. So there are ways that if you don't log into a meeting within 10 minutes and you're meant to be there, you don't get credit for it. And I think the same could be programmed on the back end. So if you leave 15 minutes early or 30 minutes early, then you don't get credit for it. So that time being logged there, I know up front we can do that. So if you're literally 10 minutes late or more, you don't get credit for that session. Surabhi, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I like your approach. But then the problem that comes in is they might all be viewing it from one computer. So not everyone in that room is logged on. So how do you track? And in such cases, I can only suggest that you can mandate that everyone needs to log in separately, even though they might be viewing from a big screen, a big television screen or projector, whatever, but they still need to log in separately. so that we can track for the purposes of the completion of training, as Laura was saying, how many minutes have you been logged, and there are ways where the engagement can also be tracked, whether the computer was actively doing something else, or the person was attentive and had the right window open, and so on and so forth. Again, I'm not an IT specialist, but I have been told that there are ways in which the engagement of each attendee can be tracked. It's only a matter of that we have to mandate that everyone logs in from a different computer, from a different device, if not a computer, to be able to log their engagement.
Yeah, and I would just also, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that we actually at one point tried a knowledge check, and, to make sure that they did listen to the entire SIV or meeting, and it didn't really work. I just wanted to share that. I mean, it just kind of annoyed the PI and their staff, and that probably wasn't worth it. So I think it's a good question, but it feels like one that IT could help with too. So, okay.
Yeah, in our observations as sponsors, we're always a little amazed to go into meetings that everybody's around the table and the presentation's up on the screen. Of course, there's some people off site, so we're using a WebEx for it. And then we look around and everybody lives on their laptop, so everyone in the live meeting still has their laptop open and logged into it. So I don't know. That's one approach to track, but it's something we'll need to work on as we go forward. We are running out of time, so let me know if there's any more questions out there. I've got one up that I'll direct to you, Laura, because you actually mentioned, it's just a minute ago about timing of when somebody can come into a meeting and leave a meeting. The question is, do you separate out your IMs into a clinical section, clinical scientific section, and a separate administrative section? What do y'all do?
Yeah, I think I would go back to the concept of the modules. So I guess the answer to the question is we definitely would separate out the clinical piece, because like Surabhi said, whether your clinical team can call into the meeting, that would be first choice, right? But it could be pre-recorded. And then the various other, I guess they're called administrative sections, right? So that would be, drug prep, data management, and the rest of everything else you need to cover. But again, my preference would be to do it by modules, because those meetings often change last minute. The data management coordinator can't come at the time that they were assigned. So I just think flexibility in moving those parts around is important. I hope that helps.
It does. I want to wrap up. We're almost out of time here. And first, just thank you, Laura, and thank you, Surabhi, for being involved in this. I hope our attendees appreciated that they can improve investigator meetings and SIVs. We can make them more engaging, more exciting, more memorable. And I also want to thank Marcus Evans and pass it back over to Melanie, who has hosted this meeting. Thank you very much. Melanie?
Thank you, Mark. Yes, thank you, Mark, Surabhi, and Laura for sharing these great insights. And thank you all for being so generous with your time today. We would also like your feedback. So if you could take a minute to answer our very brief survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the session, that will be very much appreciated. And a reminder to look out for an email within the next 2 hours with links to download today's material. On behalf of ScienceMedia and Marcus Evans webinars, we would like to thank you all for joining us, and we do hope that you will be listening at our next webinar. Thank you.